really be entirely dependent on your research question or questions. So I obviously haven't been involved in that part of the morning, but I know a lot of you have kind of got research questions that you're interested in. So I think the most important thing for any funding application is that your methods are appropriate in order to be able to answer your research questions. So you can have the next slide, Steph. So qualitative methods are typically used and they're used to answer research questions, tend to be about views, knowledge, experience, meaning and perspective from the standpoint of whoever your chosen participants are. And qualitative methods can be appropriate for a number of different reasons. So some of these are things like to gain an in-depth understanding of a topic or issue, but they might also be used to explain quantitative findings or to help develop quantitative measures. They can also be used as part of a process evaluation in combination with some form of outcome evaluation, such as a randomized control trial. They can also be used to establish feasibility and or acceptability of other study designs, interventions or treatments. And they can be used in combination with other methods and cross-referenced, which cross-reference to each other. And this is often described more as mixed methods, where we kind of draw on the strengths of both qualitative and quantitative methods and try and kind of truly combine the two. Funders do expect to see qualitative methods in funding applications where they're appropriate to your question. And many panels, I know the panels that I sit on have kind of qualitative expertise, and they'll specifically look at that element of your application. So whatever the reason for using qualitative methods, it's really important that you justify why they're necessary. Okay, Steph, next slide. So as well as justifying choosing qualitative methods, there are a number of other really important pieces of information that should be presented in the qualitative section of your application. And obviously this level of detail depends on kind of what stage your application is at, whether it's an outline, whether it's a stage 2, and kind of the word count that you're allowed. But within those restrictions, there is some key information that's really important to get across. So first of all, you need the aim and the objectives of the qualitative piece of research. So as I say, it's often used in combination with other methods. So you need to clearly state what the aim of the qualitative piece of work is. And don't forget to give the overall design of the qualitative method. So are you proposing interviews, focus groups, observations, and why have you chosen that method? For example, one-to-one interviews might be most appropriate when you're looking at a sensitive topic, while focus groups provide more of a socially negotiated view, and they're useful where you've already got a pre-existing group that's already there that you can tap into. Also think about whether you're proposing, certainly in the current climate, face-to-face methods or other methods such as kind of telephone or online, say if it's interviews or focus groups. And it's sometimes useful to keep those options open, certainly, as I say, in light of the current climate. But you have to remember that what you're proposing will have to go through ethical review. It's also important to let funders know who you're suggesting is taking part in your qualitative research. So this might be patients, professionals, other key stakeholders, all of these sorts of people. And don't forget the other kind of potentially relevant participants. For example, often when I do process evaluations, I need to remember to include participants who might have declined to participate in the main study. You also need to think about how many participants you'll need. And I know you might have heard qualitative researchers talking about achieving data saturation rather than specific numbers. And data saturation is basically where no new themes are thought to emerge from kind of the next 3 consecutive interviews that you're carrying out. However, you do need to propose some sort of numbers specifically to help you calculate your costs. In terms of numbers, there's kind of no right figure, and it depends on what you're proposing and why you're proposing that kind of research. As a qualitative researcher, I often base my numbers on kind of my previous experience and knowing roughly how many people we've interviewed for certain questions in the past. But overall, I'm sure everybody's aware that numbers for qualitative research tend to be much smaller than quantitative research because you're really looking for that depth of data. And if you have absolutely no idea of numbers, it's useful to kind of look at other similar qualitative studies and look at the numbers of participants that have been included. You also need to explain how you'll sample participants. And again, this will largely depend on your question and your likely participants. So for example, it may need to be a convenience sample, which, as its name suggests, involves the sample being drawn from a part of the population that's close to hand. And this might be necessary wanted to speak to other health professionals in your field. It might be kind of a small field, or people at a particular site, so they're kind of already there. There is a convenient sample. Snowball sampling, where existing participants recruit future participants from among their acquaintances, is often used with hard to reach populations. Purposive sampling is frequently used to produce a sample that sort of logically assumed to be representative of your population of interest. But again, you need to be clear how you're going to generate this. So are you going to sample on age, gender? Is it something about experience? It might be experience with a particular condition. You might want participants from particular arms of a trial, say, but that really needs to be stated in advance. Another alternative to this is theoretical sampling, which also involves selecting participants based on specific characteristics. But this is done more so as data collection progresses in order to kind of develop and test findings and theoretical assumptions as you go along. Again, you probably need to do a little bit of reading around sampling and choose that fits best with your research. Sometimes the answers are very clear because there are certain restrictions on what you can and cannot do with who you want to talk to, but you can have a read around that. Okay, and the next slide, please, Steph. It's also important to outline at least briefly how you're actually going to recruit participants. Sometimes there is some key elements missing from funding applications. So again, if your qualitative study is nested within a larger study, sometimes participants are asked to express an interest in being contacted for the qualitative research while they're being recruited to the larger, say, quantitative study. If they're not, how are you going to go about recruiting, and will you be advertising for volunteers? There are lots of different possibilities, but you want to convince the funding panel that you can successfully recruit participants. You also need to include how you'll capture your data. Typically, we record interviews and focus groups. We audio record and then transcribe them. But you might need video recording if you're doing observational studies. But again, this needs to be justified, and probably somebody who's talking about GDPR and that kind of thing. So it really has to be necessary data collection. So you need to justify why you have to do that. And again, it would have to pass the scrutiny of an ethics committee. Often people use field notes. These tend to be used in addition to recordings, because field notes alone might not be considered kind of rigorous enough. Funders also need to know how you intend to analyse the data. Again, it'll depend on the sort of data you're collecting and what your research aims are. Some common methods here, things like thematic analysis, framework analysis, or using mixed methods matrix if you're collecting both qualitative and quantitative data. But again, make sure you're kind of familiar with what the options are. Funding panels also expect some sort of mention of theory in the qualitative section. And once again, it really depends on your kind of area of interest, but theory can help you think about how you design the research question. You know, it might guide how you choose what data you're going to collect and how you interpret that data, your form of analysis. Again, you probably need to do some reading around this, and I know theory can really bog some people down. And this is where it might be useful to include somebody with qualitative expertise if you're funding as a team. And once again, funding panels will make sure there is somebody with relevant expertise as part of a team if it's a team application. And finally, I know somebody's going to talk to you about costings, but don't forget to add costings for whatever qualitative methods you're going to use. So things like staff time, if they're completing interviews, or focus groups. With focus groups, you might need a couple of people, somebody to run the focus groups, somebody to observe it. You might want to pay participants or reimburse participants for their time or for travel. You might have costs for traveling to interviews or focus groups. There's also things like equipment. So I tend to use encrypted digital recorders, but if you're videoing, that's going to be even more expensive. And don't forget transcription costs. Transcription can be time consuming. We normally send that out to a company, but that can be one of the biggest costs for your qualitative research. So that's a whistle-stop tour of what you can include. I don't know whether we've got time for questions now.